Hey everyone, it's Jonathan. Merry Christmas! Welcome to the final episode in our Christmas Carol mini-series. Today I'm joined by Nicki from Trivial Theater and Dan from TYTD Reviews, and we're talking about a version of the story that's been recommended to me a bunch of times over the last year, Rod Serling's A Carol for Another Christmas. Both Nicki and Dan had suggested this one to me, so when I decided to cover it for this batch of Christmas Carol versions, I had to have them join me. So I went into this movie completely blind. Like I knew it existed because it had been recommended to me like several times over the last year. I think both of you recommended it, and you weren't the only ones.
Oh,
So this actually was the like I had planned to not do Christmas Carol versions this year because I was in the middle of doing Cinderella versions and I didn't want to stop. But then I was like, well, so many people keep requesting this or recommending it. I was like, I should just do it. And then there's some other ones I want to do. So, but yeah, I went in completely blind and I did not know what I was expecting because I thought this was an episode of The Twilight Zone. And then, Nicki, you set me straight on that because I was looking for it in the Twilight Zone series. And apparently it's a movie by itself.
it was definitely in the same kind of because it came out in '64 and Twilight Zone ended in '63, and it was written by Serling. So 100% understanding why you had that thought.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in effect, it is the Twilight Zone movie we never actually got from Serling,
Would have
because
been
it has
better.
all of those. Yeah, it has all of those kind of tropes. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Even though it's not like official Twilight Zone. If you told me that the Twilight Zone ended with this movie, I'd be not only perfectly okay with it, I'd completely understand because it seems very much like a line being drawn under that kind of filmmaking, at least from Serling. I mean, I know he came back in the 70s with the Night Gallery, but it's very Twilight Zone-esque, even if it isn't Twilight Zone.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
And I will tell you, just from a lover of the Twilight Zone, the move or the show that we got left with as the very last episode of the Twilight Zone, or at least Serling's version of the Twilight Zone, is called the Bewitching Pool, and it is so bad. It's such a like it's not a terrible episode in itself, but it is such a letdown for such a fantastic series. To go out
Mm.
on this would have been so much better.
Oh, absolutely.
But
Absolutely. And the thing that kind of irked me the most when I was doing the research for this episode about this was just how kind of mixed the feedback was for this. Like, obviously, the Bewitching Pool is I haven't watched it yet, but from what you've told me, is going to be a poor way to end the show. But having watched this and then having seen what the critical response to it was, it made me quite angry, all things considered. I was just sitting there going, well, what do you want? If you watched this and came away from it going, I don't know if I can help you, you know?
I mean, I think there are, and we'll get more into it. I think there are legitimate criticisms of this. It worked. There are, and like I say, we'll talk more about it. But I think there are, you could look at it. It was done in like some of the more heavy-handed Twilight Zone episodes that deal with morality and moral codes and messages and such. They can be very, very heavy-handed in their approach and how they do it. And not that this is unnecessarily heavy-handed, but you could look at it and say, there's no subtlety. It's, this happened, boom. But I think in the spirit of the not that all versions of the Christmas Carol are, the messages and don't like the messages, generally speaking, a bit heavy-handed just because of what it is. But it's there's a variety of subtleties, and this isn't subtle at all.
Nuanced, but not subtle.
Right. No, absolutely. And there is a definite difference. So
Absolutely. And I mean, I was fascinated as well, just seeing how this thing got created as well, because, looking at how it all came about, it kind of brought together a lot of people who had just come off the backs of either very frustrating or very awkward productions, and they'd all kind of been pulled together. I mean, Jonathan, I don't know, have you got anything you'd like to say about the behind the scenes before I kind of, I don't want to walk over you with this, but just going into detail about it all.
Well, the main thing that I thought would be important to mention is that I found out this was commissioned by the United Nations, which I found that out after I watched it. I was like, oh, well, that makes sense, given what they were talking about in there. But
Yeah.
like I said, I went into this blind. I had no idea. And I think I was expecting something really science fiction-y and less bleak, depressing anti-nuclear war parable.
Fair.
I took to nicknaming it Christmas Threads because we had a BBC drama over here called Threads in the 80s that was basically like what would happen if a nuclear bomb hit England, and it's one of the most depressing and bleak things that the BBC has ever produced. So this is basically just the Christmas version of that. But no, you're absolutely right. It was initially produced by the United Nations. What they wanted to try and do was put across the work that the UN did, because they felt that the average American audience didn't quite understand what the UN stood for, at least at the time. So they set up a non-profit charity called the Telson Foundation, and the idea of the charity was to subsidize the cost of producing. At the time, it was commissioned to do 6 specials, but they only ended up ever making 4. Each one was supposed to be centered around a pillar that the United Nations stood for, one of which was obviously de-escalation of nuclear arms and ultimately disarmament. And like I say, from there on, it really kind of it interested me because they managed to get all of these people in who had just come off the back of like bad turns. So, for example, Serling had just come out of the Twilight Zone, having had a heck of a time for the last like 5 seasons, just constantly being hit by the studios on what he had to do and being forced to do advertising against his will and having to kind of change the run times and move the show around in the schedules. He got messed about quite badly. The director, Joseph L. I always get his last name mispronounced. Makowitz, yes. He had just come off the back of filming Cleopatra, which had some not so great feedback. So he was quoted at the time as saying he was just happy to be in work. This was the only television thing he ever did. He was also known for All About Eve and The Barefoot Contessa, but he got drafted into this. And you've got Peter Sellers, who had just come out of hospital after having his near-fatal heart attack. He signed on to the production, and this was his first thing that he did after that. Also managed to pull a very young Britt Ekland, who was married to him at the time, into the production as well. And they tried to shop it around to various companies to get some extra funding for the charity, so that they could book the time. And one of the only big companies that could really offer any money was the Xerox Corporation. They basically said, well, we'll give you $4 million to do this.
That's very random.
Yeah, they basically put feelers out to all these companies, and Xerox were one of the only ones that came back and said, yeah, we'll do it. Here's $4 million. Enjoy. They must really want nuclear disarmament and excellent photocopying abilities. Good on Xerox. So with that $4 million, it mainly bankrolled securing the airtime, and they went to all of the different television companies, and a lot of them didn't want to touch it because there was a lot of certain groups of people disliked the United Nations because they felt that it was a nanny state kind of situation. They didn't like the idea. They wanted to be in control of what their governments did, and they didn't like some outside force telling the government what they should and shouldn't be doing. So a lot of television studios didn't want to touch it because they thought that it might cause controversy. But ABC said, yeah, we'll have it. And they agreed to broadcast, at least in principle, this one, which was the first one, and they obviously did the 3 more, but they never managed to get the last 2 made. And yeah, they basically, this is one of the few television specials that broadcast completely without commercial breaks, because they felt that the subject was so important that they didn't want it to be interrupted every 10 to 15 minutes with like product sponsors and stuff like that, which must have made Serling very, very happy. Didn't have to shill Oasis cigarettes anymore,
Yeah, those showed up on some of the. I'm part of a podcast that does Twilight Zone, and that's one thing I always bring up. It's like some of the ones where cigarette ads show up on. It's like there was one that involved a kid in particular, and it's just like this episode has been all about kids, and yet here's this ad for Chesterfields. It's just like, oh my god.
Basically, it's mad. It really is. But Serling was given the brief of exploring nuclear conflict. Obviously, Serling himself was a very progressive. I can't speak for him to say he was a socialist, but he had a lot of very socialist principles. He had served in the wars and had had some very traumatic experiences in there, and he came out of the military service wanting to try and explore his trauma through his writing. And this is prevalent through a lot of Twilight Zone stories, and is prevalent here. He very much makes his views on war and particularly nuclear conflict very well known. I mean, I personally think that some of his best writing comes from when you can tell the character is basically almost morphed into Serling, just giving a monologue about his own personal feelings.
Well, and look at how like anyone that writes the things like, well, they always say write what you know. And to be able to work through those things, like whether you're talking about, it was first. I'm sorry, I can't think of what the actual episodes were, but the one that always comes to mind is from the first season. It's probably like 5 or 6 episodes in, but yeah, that was one of several that Serling wrote for himself, or wrote about himself or his own experience, and definitely plays in.
Probably not the one with the living doll.
No. I mean, it's possible, but this one specifically, no.
It was the Trouble with Templeton. That was the one.
Oh, God.
So like he claimed that his one of his main inspirations for this was some of the elements of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was still a very hot topic, as only happened a couple of years prior to this happening. He wrote the script and shopped it around, and that was where Sellers became involved. And surprisingly, given that he'd just come out of hospital and was spending tons of money in medical bills, he actually chose to appear in this for the minimum SAG wage at the time, which was $350, because he thought that the script was so powerful and it was something he so wanted to be involved with. Normally he would charge, I think it was something like 150,000 or something, some ridiculously high number, but he waived it for the base fee because he thought it was really important. And they also managed, and this annoyed me a little bit actually when I found this out, they managed to get Henry Mancini, famous composer, to write the incidental music and theme tune for this. After the initial broadcast, it got the music stripped out of it, basically, because of some copyright wrangling that went on. And it's only recently been put back in when it has recurring broadcasts. So, yeah, it's had a time. And all of these people came together over it. And it was a nice thing to see, especially given that it's a Christmas-themed film. It had that nice heartwarming vibe of all these people who were down on their luck or had just come off bad turns being drawn together to produce something very human.
Oh yeah.
Very humanity focused. But I don't want to get ahead of myself too much here, because I appreciate I've just done quite an info drop, so I shall go quiet now and hide in the corner. Thank you.
No, that's fine.
Your British is showing their Dan.
The backstory is just as interesting as the movie itself, so
totally.
That's fine.
One other interesting thing about this, real quick, so it was aired in 1964, and it didn't air again, or wasn't seen again until TCM in 2012, I believe.
Yes, it basically got lost in the vault somehow. From what I could find, they struck 16mm prints that they sold for educational purposes to schools. So the idea was that you'd show this as part of, like, I don't know, maybe a history class or a sociology class or something like that. But from those 16mm prints, bootlegs were ripped, which then did sort of trade on the VHS market for a very long time. 2012, TCM broadcast it, but with all the Harry Mancini music taken off it. And it was only December 2021 that they put all of the music back in. And yet, apparently, according to the TCM's website, it's an annual screening now. They do it every year around December. They play this. It's also available on HBO Max, at least for now.
Yeah, that's where I watched it.
Nice.
Or I guess
Well, and
it'll
that's
be
one thing.
Max now because apparently they took off the HBO branding for some reason.
Yeah, that's a one of a kind thing right there. They're never boring. But one thing, before we get into more of the actual meat and potatoes of the movie, I gotta say, like one thing with Serling is that about 90% of his stuff for through the Twilight Zone at least is kind of timeless. Like the things that applied in the 50s and 60s apply 60 years later. And obviously humankind and the ways that we roll, they change, but they don't change. Like there's variations on a theme.
I think that's why I found this so bleak.
Oh no.
Given
And
what all's going on around the world, I think that's why I found this so bleak myself.
Oh no, and 100% understood. But it is, I mean, he had a way. There's just Serling. Just he has such a way of writing just people and humanity and situations. And I just was sitting there thinking about it after I got done watching it, and it just blows my mind because there's a lot of people that can't do that, and to have that ability is just, yeah, it's amazing.
No, absolutely. I remember, I don't know whether you, Triv, had seen this prior to our viewing last year of it.
No, it was my
but
first time.
Yeah, no, it was one we we sort of dug out and decided we'd sit and watch it. And by the end of it, we were both kind of just sat in a slightly stunned silence, going, "How has nobody bought this? What is going on? This is basically like what's happening now." But there's a lot of very, very prevalent themes that carry through to the modern day, especially now more so than ever with all of the various conflicts that are going on, and certain political groups, trying to mobilize various similar restrictions to our main character. It's a fascinating watch because it seems now more relevant than ever, and it just astounds me that so few people have seen it. Like even the Twilight Zone fans generally don't talk about this, which again just blows my mind when again you can consider that this, had it been the finale of the Twilight Zone, would have been considered a high, and if you played it, wouldn't question it being anything other than a Twilight Zone episode. The only thing that's really missing is the Serling introduction.
Yeah. You almost did expect that, like, Mr. Daniel Grudge, a man who has seen war, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, you expected him to pop out at one point and start doing what he did so well.
Oh yes, absolutely. And for the purpose of tonight's gathering, I chose to watch this as Rod Serling would have intended, on YouTube, being broken into every 8 minutes by adverts. Which was particularly fantastic, and not to jump too far ahead, but there was a wonderful moment where Daniel Grudge is talking to the Ghost of Christmas Present, and the Ghost of Christmas Present has this very impassioned monologue about how people are gluttonous and they rely too much on commercial luxury goods, and the time for luxury is over, and we've got to pull together as humanity. And then it hard cut to like this really bougie advert for ASOS clothing and jewelry that was like really high class. I laughed for a solid like 30 seconds. It was amazing. I just have no.
I get a lot of ads for Temu. Is that better or worse than bougie? If you're talking about commercial luxuries.
That's a hard question.
I don't know. It's just it's wild, and the thing as well that blew my mind is it hasn't had any kind of home release at all. Like the streaming service, the showing on Max, is technically like the first time it's been widely commercially available outside of being randomly shown on TCM every year. It's never had a DVD or a Blu-ray. It's never gone on VHS, and I find that amazing, really, when you consider how interesting a piece of history it is, not necessarily just for the topics it's covering or for the people associated with it, but just how it takes that Christmas Carol narrative and kind of reworks it into something a little bit altogether different. The kind of key beats are still there vaguely, but it almost deviates into its own path and rhythm as it starts becoming more impassioned about the subjects that it's talking about. But yeah, no, I personally really enjoyed this one. I think it's a very thought-provoking piece. Heavy-handed, absolutely. I mean, Peter Sellers in a cowboy hat will be, let's say, not exactly subtle.
I actually did see a thing that like I was looking through reviews of this on IMDb, and it said Dickens meets Orwell meets Dr. Strangelove, and that feels pretty right on.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see that. That's a good one. I like that. I think the thing that really cheesed my biscuit, so to speak.
Oh, stop with this British slang. How are we supposed to understand?
Is that actual British slang or just something you came up with?
That's just me making stuff up. It's fine. Somebody's probably said it. That really ritzed my crackers was
that just ghosted my Christmas past.
was kind of the mixed response that this got when it was broadcast. Like Serling's work, I wouldn't say it was divisive necessarily, but it could be controversial to certain subsections of the population. What got me wasn't so much that there were strong opinions about it, but there seemed to almost be a lack of opinion about it. Like, if you look at the main critical reviews of it at the time, there was a lot of descriptions of it as being preachy, long-winded, of heavy-handed, as Trev mentioned, is another one that it got a lot of flack for. But it was generally received as kind of a, well, that exists. Which, when you consider that it's essentially like an hour and 25 minutes of a man pouring his heart out about how, you know, we as humanity cannot focus on individualism any longer, and the time for group action in order to ensure that humanity continues on as a prosperous race. And that's why, I mean, in fact, that's one angle of this script that I really do enjoy, is that it's not so heavy-handed that it's just saying de-escalation now. Mm-hmm. It's actually saying that, you know, conversations need to be had. There needs to be discussions. It can't just be shouting, get rid of the nukes, any more than it can be shouted to nuke every country that disagrees with us. Yeah. He discusses it in such a way that makes it feel like it's got to be a continuous conversation. It's got to be something we keep in check. We as humanity, you, me, Triv, we are all people who are involved in the art of humanity, and we all have to, you know, do our bit for society and civilization by extension to ensure that people are being held to account, people are being kept in check, and are having these conversations that are keeping the fighting from breaking out. So to, you know, read the reviews of it and just see a film critic kind of go, it wasn't for me. I just like, that's that. What do you mean it wasn't for you? You need to explore this a little bit more. You can't just shrug at this. It's a very powerful piece. And it also brought to my attention the John Birch Society, which I'd never heard of before. Which, unsurprisingly, I don't know if you guys know this, but apparently the right-wing viewers of this special were not too happy about its anti-nuke message.
Oh, I can't imagine why.
Yes.
They were quite annoyed that Serling decided to write a piece about how we should talk about de-escalation maybe at some point. And the John Birch Society, which apparently, I mean, for anybody who doesn't know, was a conservative group of people that ran a spectrum from socially conservative, which, you know, is your sort of people who have right-wing tendencies but aren't, like, you know, actively pursuing those things, right the way through to literal neo-Nazis. They organised a mass letter writing campaign before the film even aired to say, how dare you talk about the UN and nuclear armament, to try and force the station to pull the film. And a lot of other sort of right-wing reactionaries at the time came out against the film strongly, basically saying things about the film that implied that they hadn't even looked at it, that they'd just basically heard the word film about nuclear de-escalation and immediately went into their bloody hippies routine for 25 minutes until, you know, they were wheeled off to the next kind of convention.
As someone who was raised very conservative, that doesn't surprise me at all. That
Yeah.
sounds pretty much exactly like what would happen. Don't watch it, get mad, write somebody about it.
Oh, absolutely. I did have to laugh. So just looking at the IMDb reviews, because I did a little research behind the scenes of things, but it's always the reviews that strike me as interesting, especially on pieces like this, because this can be, like you said, very derisive. On one end of it, it says it's as subtle as a nudist at a Baptist luncheon, which I want to use that in day-to-day stuff. I don't know where I will use it, but I will use it. And on the other end, it says, Rod Serling could have never known this, but it's not very often a classic can be revived to direct us with greater relevance to the world we live in today. This is as good as it gets.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment of it. I know that at the time, the Xerox Corporation claimed that they got 6,000 letters about the special. And they described...
What is Xerox going to do about it?
Exactly. Well, and given the size of the audiences back then, I mean, you think about it, they only had like your main channels. In the grand scheme of all the people that probably watched this, 6,000 doesn't seem like it would be very many.
No, well, they said that apparently of the 6,000 letters, around about 3,000 were very strongly in favour of the film and thought that it was a very unique and interesting look at society, and around about 3,000 absolutely hated it and threatened to firebomb them. So,
so
they
things don't change.
Basically.
This is,
I mean,
again, this is why I found it so bleak. Things don't change.
No, they do not.
Well, but I think in the grand scheme, like you talk about the message, and it is bleak. There is something to that, but it does still come back at the end, and you see how Grudge looks at things that he can do to change. I mean, even in small ways, you know. And not to jump ahead, I apologize, but like there is multiple messages, and you can kind of go, okay, we as people decide where we're going.
I was going to say as well, I mean, I think a bit of the apathy as well that probably came out of this was, and I only really put two and two together when I sat and thought about people's responses to COVID recently. You got to bear in mind when this film came out, nuclear war talk had been like the hot button issue since about 1958. Like, we're going to get nuked basically was like the top story every week for, however long. And I think that by 1964, they'd had, 2 years of the Cuban Missile Crisis. They'd had, obviously, the Kennedy assassination. They had the Cold War was really bedding in with Russia. And I just think similar to how people today, when COVID dragged on for more than 2 years, kind of were just like, I don't want this in the news anymore. Get rid of it. I don't want to hear anything else about it. I'm exhausted with COVID. Just get rid of it. I think that a lot of people by this time were kind of done with nuclear war. And the last thing they wanted on the 28th of December 1964 was to sit down post-Christmas and watch an hour and a half film about how there's a very likely chance we all won't be here next Christmas. And they were just nuclear exhausted more than anything else.
Well, in the circles that I'm unfortunately in, there's a lot of people who talk about COVID like in conspiracy ways, and I get exhausted from that. So I can understand not wanting to hear anything about it at all. So I guess I can understand from that perspective.
Absolutely. And I think too, like, there's that, you're coming off of the Twilight Zone, and I think maybe people's expectations because it was written by Serling at that time. And there was some, at least with the Twilight Zone, there was probably some apathy towards that too, because of the way that things had gone as the Twilight Zone went along and such. And maybe that's part of it too.
Yeah, I could see that. I could definitely see that.
And I will say, and this is just outside perspective, and I know there's always that time thing that has to fill. There was parts where it dragged for me. Like, not that you want to get into everything as quick as possible, but the way that it was very eloquent, but it did have moments where it's like, okay, make your point.
The beginning felt like it was dragging for me, but it was like, okay, when is the Christmas Carol stuff going to start?
Right. That would be what I would think. Like, it didn't have that. And I guess, the 60s, not that they didn't know how to time things out. And Serling certainly knew how to, time things well. but whether it was written in to get more, because you don't know how many people behind the scenes were like, oh, we need to add this. Oh, don't forget that. Oh, and don't forget this other thing. There was that sense that there was a lot front loaded, 10 pounds in a 3-pound bag kind of a deal.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Like once it got going, it was nonstop. It did what it needed to do. It got you in. It made its point. It showed you these horrors on various levels, and then it got out.
Absolutely. And that intro was actually originally supposed to be longer still.
Oh, serious?
Yeah, they actually shot, but they removed it before broadcast. There was supposed to be like a prelude to Marley's death, where his dad kind of has like a nice conversation with him before he gets sent out to do service.
And the kid was Peter Fonda. Like his picture was on the wall, but otherwise he kind of was cut out.
You see his ghost briefly.
Ah, yeah, you're right.
That was another thing that bugged me a little bit, although I kind of understand it. In the opening titles, they don't credit Serling in the main titles. They list it as Joseph's.
Mankiewicz.
Yeah. And I kind of understand why they did that, because I assume they didn't want people immediately thinking it was going to be Twilight Zone-esque. Given it that it's quite a serious topic, I imagine they didn't want, the sort of connotations of Talkie Tina or the gremlin on the wing of the plane.
Which I think is what I was expecting, going in knowing that it was Rod Serling.
Oh, no. Understood.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the thing, though, too, at Twilight Zone, there were as many of those kind of like the monster of the week type things as there were those thoughtful, very like Walking Distance or, The Shelter and things like that. It kind of covered both sides, but the ones that are honestly truly remembered are those ones that are more monster-esque.
Mm-hmm.
And I do appreciate as well how unsuspecting that introduction is. With it being a Serling production, maybe the expectation would have been something a little bit more surreal. But like for the first 5, maybe even 10 minutes of this, you wouldn't think that it was going to go in the direction it ends up going in. It just kind of plays out almost like a kind of the time Christmas film. It's not got quite that Christmas atmosphere. In fact, I noticed that in Dan's house, there isn't any Christmas decorations or anything like that up. But you go from this really snowy, Christmassy title sequence to inside his house, and until the more Christmas carol-y elements start up. So, the record player playing the song when it's, been taken off the player, or seeing the ghost in the window. You could easily, just think you were tuning into some kind of wholesome, a loose adaptation of A Christmas Carol that was going to be quite warming and filled with Christmas cheer, rather than what we ended up with, which probably put you off your turkey, to be honest. But
yeah, there really wasn't a whole lot of Christmas. And then when he starts meeting the ghosts, when the one introduced himself as the Ghost of Christmas Past, it kind of took me back. I was like, oh, we're going with that name? This really has nothing to do with Christmas. Because they're like in the past on the boat with all the dead bodies, and yeah, it just didn't feel like Christmas. So I was kind of confused as to why the ghosts were still the Ghost of Christmas Past, Present, and Future.
I suppose it's because they try to establish, obviously, that these ghosts have come at Christmas Eve. At least in the opening of the film, they do.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a bit of a stretch to sort of attach Christmas to them. I mean, I suppose it's a nicer titling than calling them, the ghost of all of the soldiers that have ever died ever, or
that would be really heavy-handed.
The ghost of the poor children that had their faces blown off.
Yeah, basically. The ghost of pain, suffering, and putting people in prison camps.
The ghost of really, 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 really bad things.
Which is all of them.
Yes, which is made shorter by the ghost of R to the 18th power bad.
But yeah, no, it's difficult really, because I kind of get what they were doing, but it does kind of lose the Christmassy angle, I feel, as it goes along. I mean, there's Christmassy vibes here and there, and like I say, I can understand, at least on the script stage, where these elements came from.
Mhm.
But apart from the kind of opening and ending, there isn't really anything too festive in there.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody looks very cold. That's probably the only.
Well, I mean, Ghosts of Christmas Past, they were all dead, so, you know, it makes sense. I will say, in regards to the Christmas thing, and understanding that this is based off of A Christmas Carol, do you think that they were aiming more for the idea that this is a year-round thing? This isn't something to just think about at Christmas? Because at least by modern interpretations, you really, you know, you think kindness, goodwill towards men, all that kind of stuff. But the majority of people, it comes up at Christmas and it's heavily said, hey, do this thing. But the rest of the year, you don't really get that. And maybe that was the point. They didn't want it to go so far into Christmas because it's a thing that needs to be talked about all year.
I could really see that happening. I mean, I could see the debate roaring between how Christmassy to make it because of that. I mean, if it was me personally doing something like this, I would have started it off very Christmassy, very Christmas heavy, and then slowly peeled it away until by the end it wasn't Christmassy, and you kind of got the vibe of, oh wait, this isn't just something that happens now. It has to be something we continue on past this discussion, which actually, and again, I don't want to jump too far ahead when I say this, was one of the things I really, really loved about the ending itself, was that it doesn't end in, you know, quote, Scrooge finding the errors of his ways and dancing down the street in his nightshirt, punching orphans and buying the biggest turkeys in the shop.
Right now, I got that image in my Daniel Grudge punches out small children as he runs to find a turkey.
I like the fact that it does just end kind of solemnly with him sat in the kitchen on Christmas morning with his staff, drinking a cup of coffee, thinking about what he's just experienced. And it's not a complete change of mind. He's not sitting there going, I'm completely convinced. It ends in such a way that it makes you feel like he's hit a turning point, but he's got to put the work in to grow as a person.
It ended in a way that made sense for this version. If it had gone with the traditional Scrooge goes crazy, happy, joyful, love to all mankind, that would not have made sense for this version.
No, absolutely. And I think that was one of the things I thought was quite endearing about it, because it would have been so easy to have gone down that route. I mean, maybe not punching orphans and buying turkeys, but, you know, to kind of set him up to be this joyful soul. It kind of, instead, it plays it down. So, like, he invites Fred, Fred his nephew.
Fred is his nephew.
Yeah, he invites Fred, you know, in for a drink and wishes him a Merry Christmas. And, you know, they start to repair that relationship, because in the beginning of the film, obviously, there's a lot of struggles. And, you know, it's not something where he's like very forgiving and very taking things on. It's just very subtle and played very kind of. The end of the film could best be described as it's a start. Which, you know, I liked. I thought it was nice that they didn't get too schmaltzy.
Yeah.
Well, and you look at the way that the rest of the movie is laid out, it does kind of take that. It starts not calm per se, because, you know, they are kind of in an argument, but it kind of climaxes big and then it works its way back down to more calm again. You know, and each of the scenarios they can be described as relatively bombastic. So to kind of bring it back to that point where it's a little more calm is a nice touch.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the main criticisms, actually, that the film had, was a lot of people got hung up on the beginning 10 minutes because they said it felt like a high school debate team arguing about nuclear conflict, where you got the back and forth between Daniel and Fred about the transfer students, which, you know, it's. I mean, I quite enjoyed the fact they didn't shy away from making Dan come across as a totally irredeemable character, at least in the opening. You know, he spouts racist rhetoric. He's you know, happy to destroy entire continents if it means he doesn't have to get involved. You know, it's a very heavy-handed opening, but I think it really sets his character up as being a thoroughly unlikable person who has to go on this journey. which surprisingly, I think some Christmas carols that I've seen kind of either go too one note with it or don't go hard enough.
Yeah, I've noticed that with different ones I've done.
You just sort of end up with the Scrooge who's just like utterly irredeemably evil, like comically evil, or he's a bit too soft, and you kind of go, well, why is he getting the three ghosts treatment? I know people way worse.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think they could have tightened that opening 10, 15 minutes up quite substantially. And it does. I understand that they want to try and set the stage for the nuclear conflict side of things, but I do feel like it could have been handled a little bit better. I did get quite distracted though, just purely from the gorgeous direction, lighting, and cine of those opening sequences.
Oh, they did very well with that.
It's really nice to see black and white film use absence of light effectively rather than lighting effectively. It's an art in itself to craft light, but being able to craft shadow is a real talent, and there's a lot of shots throughout this where they use the lighting to transition as well into completely different sort of scenarios.
I'm thinking mainly of Ghost of Christmas Present with the table in the darkness and then illuminating the people in the encampment.
It felt very like black box stage to some extent, like where you have it just kind of gave that whole impression of you don't know what's in the darkness, and because at that point in time, you were coming off the McCarthy hearings, you were coming off of the missile crisis, all of these things, and I'm sure that a lot of people did feel like they were walking around kind of feeling around in present times and such.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you could say that they're in the dark on the issue. I've peaked. I'm done now. I'm going. Goodbye, everybody. Yeah, but there is some really interesting work in there, and the long tracking shots that they do where they pan down into his house and they go into his living room and the fire's roaring, but that's like the only light in the room, and one of his butlers comes through with a platter, and it pans around and follows him up the staircase, and you then cut to inside the room that Dan's listening to his record on, and it's just him silhouetted in the shadows, but you can just make out his facial features from, again, the absence of light rather than the light being there. It's a really, really nicely handled piece visually, and it was quite easy for me to kind of get lost in just how pretty it looked when the really big messages started coming out in the debatey segments. But yeah, those transitions are fabulous, are really, really good stuff for especially for television.
Yeah. Well, the one thing with Mankiewicz, his brother, who's Herman Mankiewicz, was the director of Citizen Kane. So from the perspective of not that you can judge like one family member by another family member's work, but even you look at All About Eve and pieces like that, they are beautifully shot, and director of photography handles a good chunk of that, but you've got this director that has a vision, and I mean Joseph Mankiewicz definitely knew his stuff.
No, absolutely, and it really shows here. I mean, again, considering that this really, the fact that this didn't get anywhere near a cinema just astounds me. It really does. The fact that this was shown once and then disappeared for 48 years, barring bootlegs. It'd be a bit like if they'd just played Citizen Kane on PBS once and then like it didn't turn up again until the 90s when Ted Turner colorized it. Just be like, how has this been hiding for however long it's been?
It did actually get a couple of Emmys, despite the kind of, I guess, lukewarm response. The other thing to consider too, at that point in time, like TV movies were something that were relatively common, and that distinction between what went to theaters and what went to TV, so night and day, No,
absolutely, and I suppose as well, the subject of individualism as well, which is very prominent here, wouldn't really come into its own element until the Thatcher and Reagan years. the idea of the individual in society, the fact that you are the important person, nobody else matters, it's what you can do for you, you're on your own and you've got to make the best out of your life. That kind of stuff in the 60s, it was about, but it probably wasn't anywhere near as prominent as when you get into things like the Reagan administration and that sort of 80s drive towards economic prosperity over people at all costs. I feel that might have been a message that fell on deaf ears at the time, but probably would have had a better reception further down the line had maybe they had repeat screenings in the 70s and 80s or things like that, when once these ideologies started to become much more popular.
Well, in the 80s was always kind of considered the decade of me in that respect too.
Absolutely and I mean, they could have probably even dusted off Peter Sellers for another round if they'd have, got him to put the hat on, filmed a special intro sequence. But
I think that's the thing about this that I found the most bleak was the scene in the future with all the people who are completely self-obsessed, like to the point of chanting "me." Like, it's obviously it's very heavy-handed and over the top, and that's not exactly how everybody is, but it's kind of, I don't know, just like an underlying thing, especially I feel like in American culture, about everybody focusing on themselves and nobody else. It just felt like too relevant to today. Everybody only caring about themselves to the point of they're going to kill off this other group that just wants to talk, and then they're going to come back and kill off each other because I'm the only one that matters. And yes, it's unrealistically over the top, heavy-handed, but it still felt too close to reality and just was the most depressing part for me, I guess.
Well, this was one of the things that me and Trev really picked up on when we watched it the first time, because obviously the January 6th riots had only happened a very short time before that.
Yeah.
So we were both kind of watching that going, oh no, what? No. Just stunned silence whilst it was playing out. It was
definitely
interesting.
Yeah, it was definitely a thing. And I think, and John, you can kind of, I guess, bring more light to this. And I mean, you've reviewed a ton more of the Christmas carols than I've seen, but I think the majority, like from the perspective of it being over the top, the rendition of what we see in this and the fact that we can see, a version of that playing out now. I think you could look at the 60s and say, of hippies or people that are, kind of stepping away from that, the tradition that, if your parents were, married during the war and, had all the army training and stuff, a lot of the kids of that era were raised in a very, strict household in a certain way. You get out on your own, in the late 50s, early 60s, you're going to go, I can do what I want. I have seen the way this rolls and I'm not part of it. And, they go off and do their thing. That individualism could be seen then as much as it could be seen in the 80s with that generation, as much now. So that ability to kind of see those things across the board. But that said, I do agree. There is a definite, screen pointing towards yourself thing to this generation, or, the generations in general right now, that just, it's scary.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very valid point, in fairness. And I suppose individualism as a concept evolves and changes with every generation that comes up. I mean, what was individualism to, say, the millennial generation would probably be strikingly different to, Gen Alpha or, Gen X. I mean, we used to have common grounds and aspirations, up until, I would say, the 80s. The nuclear family dynamic was aspiration. You'd have a nice house, a good, well-paying job, a nice car, you'd have a partner, kids, that kind of thing. And now that there is so much uncertainty in the world, you're seeing those aspirations shift. And especially now that we've moved almost entirely to an online culture, we're seeing a lot of what would previously have been seen as grossly abject aspirations becoming like most young people's standard aspirations. Like, you see people like Mr. Beast on YouTube where he'll just quite happily drop a couple $1 million on something. And, it's an interesting thing to sit and think what that does to young people's minds in terms of expectations and in terms of what their own individual aspirations should be. There was a real shift about 10 or 15 years ago where somebody asked a load of sort of 10 to 18-year-olds what they wanted to be when they grew up, what their sort of aspirations were, what their big plan was. And like 95% of them said, I want to be a YouTube star. I want to be famous on YouTube. And, I'm sure if you went back to like, I don't know, maybe the 50s, you'd probably 50s, 60s, 70s, you might get a handful of kids who'd say, I want to be a movie star or I want to do this or that. But I'm certain you'd probably get a much more dynamic range of, people, what they want to do with their lives compared to what, individualistic needs are today.
Oh, agreed.
Well, that was quite in depth, wasn't it? Oh, I feel all intelligent. I should stop that. But it's true though, in a way, isn't it? It's kind of it's interesting to see how every generation handles its own id, so to speak, how it handles its own drive. There's a lot of intergenerational squabbling that tends to happen online. You end up with boomers versus Gen X and millennials, or Gen Z fighting millennials, or all this. It's interesting to see what people's values are across the age ranges and how those kind of shake down to their priorities within life. Like, I'm sure probably the most common one you guys all know of is that period of time where boomers were telling millennials to just stop eating avocado on toast and they could buy a house.
Sorry.
But this is the thing though, that mindset was prevalent in that age range at that time. It was a case of they couldn't understand that a particular age bracket would have any kind of struggle to get a house, is because they never really bothered to check in on house prices or the cost of living, absolutely, or all of these other things. So, an it's aspiration to a... Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It's not a thing you have to worry about. It's like if you're someone, and this isn't a great example, but if you're someone that doesn't buy milk because, maybe you're lactose intolerant or you just don't like it or whatever, and someone that has like teenagers and buys, say, 6 gallons a week because their kids go through it, you're not going to understand the ins and outs of what that entails. It's like, well, just buy what you need. And to not understand that they've been out of that loop for so long, or that, they're so well established that they don't have to worry about that aspect. That lack of understanding and just kind of going off the cuff without having that in-depth understanding of what's going on, it does make a difference. And even more so than that, I had to laugh. I was with a group of people and there was a couple of people that were, I don't know, like mid-60s, and they were still referring to people that are, say, 18, 19 now as millennials. It's like, no, you're like a generation and a half removed from that.
Yeah.
It's like that all-encompassing tone doesn't work. But, if you're not in it, if you don't have people in that area, you're not going to outrightly think of it off, at first.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I can say I'm guilty of constantly thinking the 90s was 30 years ago. No, the 70s were 30 years ago.
Well, it's because, you have the mental age of, like a 60-year-old, so.
Yeah, I have to take my vitamins, otherwise my back hurts.
The Simpson thing about old men yelling at the sky applies to you, right?
Basically, pretty much. And but it's interesting to see how these portrayals come round as easily as they do. You could quite easily remake this film now and have it be I don't know, let's say some kind of MAGA-esque, let's just bomb every country that disagrees with us type, having a meaningful conversation with the slightly more open-minded nephew. And you could run this thing more or less beat for beat, maybe tone down the Peter Sellers bit, but, you could...
No, tone that up.
We'll make it hyper colorful. Yeah, that will be great. We'll make that work. But it's I don't think you would have to do a lot to this to freshen it up, so to speak. I mean, you could one of the things I think that works so well for it is that it doesn't reference too many things from the time.
Yeah. That's why it felt like something that could have been made today, except it was black and white.
Oh yeah.
It just felt completely relevant to everything today.
Well, and like a lot of like Twilight Zone stuff, there's only 2 or 3 episodes that are specific to the time. Like there's this one that references this car guy that can't lie. And they like Nikolai Khrushchev shows up at the end and buys a car for some reason or another. But the rest of the Twilight Zone episodes, generally speaking, unless it's like a Western, it takes place anytime. And that's the amazing thing about the series. It's timeless. And the same thing happens here, especially with the Ghost of Christmas Past. He kind of goes, well, this is Crimea, this is World War I, this is Korea, this is it could be any war at any time, because even though the weapons might change, the impact of war doesn't change.
Yeah.
And he was so good at that.
Oh yeah. No, absolutely. It's a quality that he really, really used well, especially, as time went on, it kind of evolved and morphed as he grew older. It would have been very interesting to see how his writing would have evolved, past when he passed. Like, I would have been very curious to see how Serling would have handled like the 1980s, given what he wrote here. I could hardly see him being thrilled with developments.
I just imagine him coming out. He's got the the suit that you always knew him for, but his like the shirt that looks white is actually like neon green.
Yes. He looks like a chocolate lime.
There you go. Oh my god, those are quite good, by the way.
Oh, I'll have to send you some more.
Yay. For reference, a chocolate lime is like a hard candy. It's lime on the outside, and then there's like a little like chocolate, like kind of a blow pop.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's got chocolate on the inside then. So
the closest thing I feel like I've had was years ago. I had a Halloween candy that was wrapped to look like an eyeball, and you open it, it was chocolate, and then you bite it, and it was like sour green goo inside. Ooh. It was one of the grossest candies I've ever eaten.
This is not gross, so
I wanted to say as well, the dialogue in this thing is just fantastic. There's some really, really quotable pieces. One of the ones that really stuck with me was near the end when he's talking to his nephew Fred. And he says, no man is an island. Every man's death diminishes me. We find ourselves living in a world where we greet the morning or accept the night. And I thought that's a wonderful.
And it's so like, you could look at any time period and have that, but just all the school shootings and stuff, that encompasses that right there.
Absolutely. It comes from a place, and I've said this multiple times across the show, but it just comes from such a place of passion. Like it's so wonderful to see a writer so engaged in his work. And I know that he had traumatic ties to what he's writing about here. But it puts across such a beautiful, if not very bleak, but beautifully sculpted message ultimately in terms of what he's trying to put across. And I think some aspects of the time it was produced do date it a little bit. But that's more down to television productions and budgets than anything else.
Yeah.
I think that some of the dialogue that he wrote for this piece is really quite fantastic.
Yeah, most of this is timeless. It you can tell it's dated watching it, but just from a story perspective and the messages, it's timeless.
Mm. And some of the best lines, are funnily enough, come from that moment where he's on the ship with the Ghost of Christmas Past. For the notes I made for tonight's recording, I just started basically transcribing it at one point because it was so good. There's a moment where Dan's like saying, "Oh well, our boys, they're usually okay," and the Ghost of Christmas Past turns around and goes, "Oh, which ones are yours? Can you pick them out to this big stack of boxes?" It's just like, oh, that's something else. And then there's a wonderful bit where he describes the disease of war, and the only way to fight the disease of war is to talk. The moment the talking stops, the fighting begins, and then we bleed. Then we got problems. And it's just it's said so bitterly. You know, it's. I think that's another thing though that really sells it is the conviction of the cast.
Oh yeah.
Because I think with a lesser cast, this would have been a bit hokey and a bit cringy in places, maybe even a bit cheesy.
Yeah.
But because they've got people who so sincerely believe in the messaging of this, and they're so switched on and engaged with the piece and want to do their best for it, you really get some fantastic performances. I mean, all of the ghosts, barring the slightly spooky end ghost who, I don't know, he just reminded me of something from like a 50s B-movie Poverty Row picture.
That was Robert Shaw that was doing the thing with Peter Sellers. He reminded me, and I apologize. Twilight Zone is something that it's because of the podcast. It's something that I'm, you kind of have at the front of your mind. But he reminds me of that. There's an episode called The Howling Man where this guy basically keeps Satan in the basement, under lock and key at this like very, very remote monastery, and the main brother that's there reminds me a lot of the Ghost of Christmas Future. He just, like, the way he looks, the garb, the way he speaks, it's very reminiscent of that.
Yeah, no, completely agree. That I hadn't actually put that connection together. That's a good shout there, actually, because they do have very similar styles and vibes. That episode has got a very gothic kind of low lit quality to it as well, which really comes in. Is it the Robert Shaw?
I think so.
As in the Jaws Robert Shaw.
Yes. I looked him up because I was going through trying to see if I knew anybody from somewhere, and I looked him up. I was like, wait, he was Quint in Jaws?
Yep. You also had Eva Marie Saint, who was in quite a few Hitchcock pieces too, like The Birds.
Oh yes.
She was the
maybe that's why I thought I recognized her. I glanced over IMDb. Nothing popped out of me except for Martha Kent in the 2006 Superman Returns. But that wouldn't have been why I recognized her, because she would have been much older by that point.
I think she's still kicking, I think.
Yeah, she's still alive.
Yeah. But yeah, she was, I mean, beautiful at the time. And still is. So, but yeah, when you talk about an all-star cast of this, I mean, they didn't screw around. They had all kinds of great talent. Pat Higgle was in it. I can't remember what he was from.
When I looked him up, the first thing that jumped out at me was the narrator for The Land Before Time. And then he was also the general in Muppets from Space.
He also pulled Hang 'em High, and he was Commissioner Gordon in the first two Batman movies.
I think he was in more than two, because I still need to watch all the 80s and 90s Batman movies, but I noticed more than two in his IMDb. I don't remember which ones, but I think it was more than two.
Four. Let's see here.
Could he have done the animated series?
I don't
think so.
So he did the original Batman movies with Tim Burton. He did Batman Returns. He did Batman. Oh, he did do Batman Forever. And he did Batman and Robin. So he was Commissioner Gordon in all four of those.
How did we get this far in and not discuss Hiroshima?
We've kind of been all over the place.
Real quick, he was also in Maximum Overdrive. Just wanted to make sure that was known.
I was just going through my notes and looking through, and I was like, oh yeah, there's that bit where they go to Hiroshima and they got those two kids who are like horribly burnt under a towel singing.
I did mention the faceless kids at one point, but I
Yes.
understand that's easy to pass over.
Yeah, I mean, a very eerie sequence, just generally speaking. And again, really top dialogue. My favorite line from it was, and this is a very Serling line as well. They cleared up the dead real quick. They only left the silence.
Oh god, that is a good line.
Yeah, just so powerful, and it's nice as well to see Dan be confronted with himself almost, because obviously, it's set 20 years prior to when this takes place. And you kind of see that beginning of his sort of turn towards a more inhumane standpoint where, he realizes that he can't help everybody who's here. And he has that argument over nuclear disarmament then. And his argument is basically if they hadn't dropped the bomb here and now, there'd be 2 million Americans dead, and however many more people in Japan would be dead as well. So this was the full stop that was needed, and that's why it needed to happen.
Well, I'm sure, and not having anyone that was directly associated in that way with World War II, I think that was quite the reasoning for it. It's like stop it now, stop it hard, let it not happen again, kind of a deal.
Yeah,
that's usually the reasoning for most preventative war actions.
Very true.
And it was a nice aspect, I thought, to his character as well, because, I mean, again, it would have been so easy to just make him like the baddie and just have him just say awful things all the way through and then give him a big redemption arc in the finale. I like the fact that they do give him some points that did have a kind of ethical foothold at the time. There was more nuance and depth to him in terms of just he wasn't there just purely to be awful to everybody. He did have points that were being genuinely held up as valid and considered viewpoints at the time. Not necessarily ones I agree with, but
right.
They had evidence to back why the decisions that were made and things like that.
And it was, I think if you were to go, that there are some things you can go bombastic on, look at any B movie out of the 50s and 60s, but with something like this that they wanted to make a point on, that needed to be able to get through the biases that people even then had, to make it that over the top, you would have lost half your audience right then and there. No,
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think another thing as well that sprung out to me when they were discussing this particular scene is I started to think to myself, how come there is almost a disconnect now between nuclear talk and nuclear talk back then? So like back then, everybody was kind of, well, I say everybody, a vast majority of people were united on the idea that nuclear bombs at worst should only be used as a very last resort. There was a very, very small minority of people who were like, no, let the nukes fly now. Let's just get rid of everybody because USA is great. It was widely agreed that these were very dangerous weapons and we needed to regulate them and have discussions on how not to use them rather than conversations on how to use them. And looking at modern discourse around it, there feels almost like a disconnect from that. Now people don't really seem to understand the true deadly nature of nuclear armament and nuclear weapons and the apocalypse, effectively, because if the nukes start flying, it's basically the end for pretty much everybody, the end of civilization as we know it. Not to get too bleak.
Right.
But I sort of racked my brains for thinking of how or why that disconnect has happened now. And I think one of the main reasons why there are people out there who don't know the true dangers of nuclear war now is simply because we don't have people alive anymore, really, who were there to live through it the first time. The average there's very, very few people who survived through things like Hiroshima. And most of the people who were of an age where they could appreciate what has happened are now terrifically old, if there are any really left. I mean, obviously you still have people who were kids when that happened, but like, say, for example, your average 20 to 30-year-old in 1945, 44, 45 just isn't really around anymore. So you don't have that first-hand account of how awful these weapons really are. You only have the data. And I mean, you can look at documentaries, but that's kind of a step removed from having someone sat in the same room as you going, oh yeah, I remember when that happened. And, being able to recount in graphic detail what they witnessed as a result of these attacks, and the reason why it should never happen again. And I think that just makes people a little bit more complacent and kind of opens the doorway to people who don't exactly know what they're getting into, such as certain former presidents getting a little too comfy with the idea of wanting to get the nuclear codes up and running, just to sort of threatening big chunks of the world to do what they want.
Yeah. I would also think that it's like anything, when you're a kid and you burn your hand on a stove, that muscle memory and all of that, it sticks with you. But then you become an adult and it becomes more distant. And, that, whether you're talking about, life pre-vaccines or nuclear arms or whatever it might be, I think it's easy for folks to, well, I mean, you said it, you kind of get complacent with the dangers that some things do provide. If you don't go out camping for 20 years, you're like, oh yeah, I was fine with mosquitoes when I was, in my teens. I'll be good now. You come back and you're, head to toe bitten to death for whatever reason. You need those reminders. Not that you want, nuclear alarms to come up every, 2 months or whatever. But like you say, it is a matter of complacency. It's also just a matter of there's so much else going on in the world that it's super easy to lose track of some of those things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, there's other aspects as well. Like, for example, the reveals of the death camps during the Ghost of Christmas Present. I mean, we still have concentration camps in the US and the UK. We have places where these people are basically being stored to be processed. In the US, it's the Mexican border camps that they've set up to process people coming into the country. In the UK, we have Bibby Stockholm, which is the this like cruise ship that's basically been repurposed into a holding cell for people who come into the country while they're being processed to sort of seek visas. And again, you sit there and think, well, why hasn't anybody taken a look at these situations and gone, hang on a minute, didn't we do this a very long time ago and had very, very horrible consequences from it? Why are we supporting this now? Why is this happening now?
You could also say that it's a matter of like, oh, well, we're different than what we were then. It's not the same thing. Or people go, oh, well, it worked for our fathers, it worked for our grandfathers, it worked for our great grandfathers, so it works for us. It's not right, but what can you do? It's the best we've got.
Well, it probably also comes down to like his mindset in the beginning, like he doesn't want to see it, so
exactly,
they'd rather it be happening somewhere else where they don't have to deal with it.
And that is the crux of all of it right there.
Yeah,
it's Chinatown.
You're not wrong.
This was a cheery Christmas special, wasn't it?
I was just going to say, do we have some higher note to end this on than what we've been on right now?
I mean, I think if you can, it's like, okay, if you want to take a of the time, well, not of the time example, but Citizen Kane, at the time it came out, it was panned horribly. But over the course of time, it has become one of the best, if not the best renowned movie of all time. Now, you can look at that and you can agree with it, you can not agree with it, and there's a lot of people that are on both sides of that argument. But it took time for it to be understood and appreciated. And I think that you could say the same thing about this. It's a universal message. It applies now as much as it did then. Serling behind it, was incredible. The way that it's shot, the acting talent, all of that stuff, with time, it can be more appreciated. The fact that it's shown on TCM, the fact that it's on, Max, helps it to get more traction and more eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Not that talks about the story itself as being like a more positive spin, but from the perspective of the behind the scenes, it's not locked away in a vault someplace. It's never going to see the light of day.
Agreed. I mean, I know that we've spoken about how bleak and how depressing this film is, and for the majority of the runtime, it is a very bleak and depressing and frank look at world events. But I think ultimately it does end on a positive, or something approaching a positive. It ends expressing the idea that there is still hope, that there is still time, and that if even the most stuck in his ways, racist, anti-communist, America for the Americans style bigot can not change overnight, but turn a corner at least. There's hope for the rest of us. The film across the runtime explores a lot of socialist principles. A lot of stuff that I personally try to aspire to in regular day-to-day life. And I think that the end of the film could be viewed in two ways. One is that it could be viewed as a kind of, forever climbing the stairs of change type thing that does look a little bit bleak. But I do think that it also ends on the flicker of change being possible, and that it just takes time and talking and understanding to eventually reach these people, and that we as a collective need to come together to improve society and culture and the world through our own day-to-day actions, rather than relying on our governments to do these things on our behalf, or through individual actions. I think that it's a bleak film, but I do think it ends with a very hopeful, if not necessarily positive, message.
And there you have it.
We'll try to look at it from that perspective. I think I'm too focused on the fact that nothing changed since then, but you do have a good point.
Well, and John, we've kind of gabbed on, but having seen it and the discussion that's taken place, what are your kind of thoughts?
I mean, I liked it as a good film, but like I said, I found it very bleak, and I was kind of depressed by the end of it.
And I think definitely, like, and you guys kind of talked about it before, but the way that this doesn't follow, Grudge running down the street yelling Merry Christmas and punching small children in the face with, Christmas spirit. Sorry, I can't get that image out of my head now. It works for like the 18th century aspects, and even like something like Scrooged, where there is a definite like joyful type of a tone. To bring this particular film to a place where it ends and he's all like holly jolly and tossing his nephew over his shoulder and singing, well, he's a jolly good fellow, probably wouldn't be the tone that you'd want to take for this. The tone matches the movie.
Yeah.
And it's building that possibility of things to come, that ideally speaking, if you want to be realistic about it, that would be the route that you would probably take. You would consider what you had been through and, think in depth about it and what can you do to change and all the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of, Serling, if nothing else, was a very pragmatic individual in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I usually, when it comes to charting my own thoughts on a film, I normally take into consideration how long a film stays with me after I've watched it. And the last time I saw this, which was with yourself, Triv, it stayed with me for a good few weeks after the credits rolled. It in part because of what it was trying to do and how relevant it was to the modern day, but also in part for just how few people had seen it. I mean, I looked on Letterboxd at the time, and this was a year or two ago, and it was like triple digits. It wasn't even in the thousands of people who'd rated or seen this. It was for a work that shows what it shows to have so little viewership. It stayed with me. I spent a good week or two just occasionally popping back into that film just to, whether it was the visuals and how striking they were, or whether it was just lines of dialogue or things like that, it just kept coming back, which I take to mean that it did something right, because if it had been forgettable, we probably wouldn't be here talking about it now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess that's probably a good place to end this one.
Yay!
Hey, Merry
So
Christmas to all, and to all a good night.
go turn up the music, have a drink with your butler and your cook, and contemplate life and work towards something better.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, well, I guess that will be all for this episode. Do you guys want to let people know where they can find you if they want more from you? Dan?
Yeah, sure. So I am available on TYTD Reviews on YouTube. We've just come off the back of a bit of a hiatus. There should be some new videos coming in January. We're going to be back in full force with reviews. Also available on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, under TYTD Reviews as well.
I'll call it Twitter until I die.
It's Twitter. It is Twitter.
Yes.
But I'm available there under TYTD Reviews. And if you like reading, I'm on Letterboxd as well.
Hooray! Hey Dan, how do you pronounce the director's last name?
I'm going to say, you drat, you've foiled me with my partial dyslexia. How dare you?
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
But thank you so much for having me on, by the way, as well, Jonathan. It's always a delight to get together with you guys and chat movies. Next time we're going to do Gremlins 2 at some point, weren't we?
Yes, we try and get to that sooner rather than later.
Something a smidge lighter.
Yes. What about you, Nicki? Where can we find you?
You can find me here on YouTube at Trivial Theater. I don't have any Joseph L. Mankiewicz movies. I like that. But I do a wide variety of random, obscure, and straight up bad movies. By the time this airs, hopefully I'll have some Christmas content out or Christmas adjacent content. I have no idea at this point what's going to be up, but you can stop by and you'll always find something kind of unique. So definitely stop by and say hello.
Okay, well, thank you guys for joining me. Despite the grim, bleak film, I had a good time talking about it. So,
And John, we love you to death, man. It's always a pleasure
yes.
to talk with you.
yeah,
Absolutely.
Thanks. It's always fun to talk, even
Yay.
about bleak things. Okay, well, we'll see you next year.
Mankiewicz.
Thanks for listening to Every Version Ever. If you like what you've heard, make sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform or to our YouTube channel. Make sure to follow my co-hosts as well, and if you want more content from us, check out one of the other podcasts in the I Heart Movies podcast network, or check out my brand new Patreon. My link tree, as well as any other relevant links, will be in the description. We'll be back soon with another brand new episode, so thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.